My son looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Mom, don't come to my wedding. You'll ruin it just by being there." So tell me, how does a mother raise a man for 30 years only to be told she's not family anymore? If you've ever felt invisible, stay till the end. This story is for you. After tomorrow, you're no longer part of this family. Those words didn't come from a stranger. They came from her Lydia Carter, the woman my son was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours. I stood there in the soft, golden haze of the rehearsal dinner lights, surrounded by laughter and the clinking of wine glasses, and yet I felt a coldness that cut straight through the noise. Her lips had barely moved, but the venom in her voice was sharp enough to pierce bone. The scent of red wine and gardenia perfume hung in the air. Guests were chatting in the next room, their voices rising in bursts of joy. I held a small box in my hands, wrapped neatly in ivory paper. Inside it lay the scrapbook I had been working on for weeks. Every photo, every note, every memory of my son's life was pressed between those pages like fragile petals. When Lydia said it, she smiled. Not the kind of smile you give to family, the kind that warns you to disappear quietly. I blinked, unsure if I had heard her right. "Excuse me?" She leaned closer, her tone almost playful. "You raised him. I'll take it from here." My fingers tightened around the box. For a second, I wanted to believe she was joking, but her eyes told me the truth. Cold, certain. "Don't embarrass yourself tomorrow," she whispered. "He's not your little boy anymore." My heart clenched. I felt the air leave the room, and yet, I didn't say a word. The only sound was the faint music in the background, a love song that suddenly felt cruel. That was the moment I realized the wedding might belong to them, but the story was still mine. And by morning, that story would shatter everything they had built. I had spent nights sitting at my kitchen table, cutting and gluing the memories of a lifetime into that scrapbook. The first page held a picture of Michael with chocolate smeared on his cheeks, holding the cake I baked for his 10th birthday. The last one showed him in his graduation gown, smiling at the camera like he could take on the whole world. I brought it to the rehearsal dinner because I wanted to give it to Lydia, to show her the boy behind the man she loved. I imagined her leafing through it, laughing, maybe even tearing up. Instead, she refused to touch it. "Maybe you should keep it," she said lightly. "It seems sentimental." That word stung, sentimental. As if love was a weakness, as if memories were burdens. My throat burned. I wanted to say, "This is what built him. This is what love looks like." But the words tangled in my chest. I could only nod. When I turned away, I caught my reflection in the window, a woman standing alone in a room full of people. My hair was perfectly set, my dress freshly pressed, but I looked like a ghost haunting her own life. In the reflection behind me, Lydia laughed with her bridesmaids. They were all glitter and champagne. She didn't look back once. I set the scrapbook on the table beside a vase of white lilies. "For Michael," I whispered, but even then, I knew she'd never let him see it. Later that night, when I came back for it, it was gone. And that was the first sign that something much darker was already in motion. Outside, the rain had started. Maplewood streets shimmered under streetlights, and I walked to my car with the echo of her words pounding in my ears. "You're no longer part of this family." Each drop of rain felt heavier than the last. My hands shook as I tried to fit the car key into the ignition. I couldn't stop replaying every moment: Michael's first steps, his first heartbreak, the nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home from college. I had given him everything, and now, a stranger was telling me that none of it mattered. In the rearview mirror, I saw the lights of the banquet hall glowing behind me, soft and distant. Somewhere inside, they were probably toasting to tomorrow. I thought about turning back, about storming inside, demanding respect, demanding the truth. But instead, I sat there, breathing in the silence until the rain drowned out my thoughts. When I finally started the engine, my reflection flickered in the mirror, again older, sadder, but with something new stirring behind the tears. A question. What if walking away tonight wasn't the end of something, but the beginning? I drove home slowly through the storm, clutching the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The scent of Lydia's perfume still clung to my sleeve, sweet, sharp, and impossible to forget. As I parked in front of my house, thunder rolled across the sky. I looked down and realized the box with the scrapbook wasn't in my car anymore. I must have left it on that table under the lilies. For the first time in years, I didn't cry. I simply sat there, staring through the windshield, feeling something inside me crack open, not from weakness, but from clarity. If she had stolen my memories, she would soon learn what those memories were worth. Because I had raised more than a son, I had raised the truth. If you've ever felt pushed out of your own family, stay with me till the end. This story is for you. That night, as the rain drummed softly against my window, I thought about everything that had brought us to that moment. You do not raise a child for 3 decades without giving away pieces of yourself. I gave away nearly all of mine to build Michael's world. When his father left, Michael was only 7. He had a chipped front tooth, a toy truck in his hand, and a question I could not answer. Is he coming back, Mom? I remember crouching down beside him, pretending to fix the loose wheel on that truck so he would not see my tears. That night, when he finally fell asleep clutching it, I sat on the floor beside his bed and made a silent promise. Whatever his father took with him, I would replace with love. Street Luke's hospital became my second home. The smell of disinfectant never quite left my clothes, no matter how often I washed them. I worked nights so I could walk Michael to school in the mornings. My co-workers used to joke that I lived on caffeine and hope. They were not wrong. At 3 in the morning, when the world outside was asleep, I would sit in the break room with a stale cup of coffee and a photo of him taped inside my locker. That picture, Michael in his Little League uniform with grass stains on his knees, kept me awake better than any caffeine could. When my shift ended, I would stop by the diner across the street. The cook there, Mr. Lewis, always saved me an apple turnover that was left over from the night before. It cost 50 cents. I would wrap half of it in a napkin and take it home for Michael. Breakfast of champions, I used to tell him, and he would grin through his missing tooth. One morning, after weeks of double shifts, I came home to find a small piece of paper on the kitchen table. Michael had drawn 2 stick figures holding hands. Beneath it, he wrote in shaky letters, "Me and Mom, we win." I kept that paper in my wallet for years. It was the proof that even in the quiet exhaustion of survival, we were still winning. But love, I would learn, does not protect you from the pain that success brings later. Michael was 10 when he handed me a small box wrapped in notebook paper. His cheeks were pink from running home after school, and his fingers trembled as he pushed it toward me. Inside was a thin silver bracelet, the kind you might find at a flea market, with crooked engraving on the inside. M+H. I used my allowance, he said proudly. So everyone knows you're my mom. That bracelet became my armor. I wore it every day, even at the hospital where jewelry was not allowed. The nurses teased me, but I did not care. The metal left a faint circle on my wrist, a small mark that reminded me why I worked myself to the edge of collapse. Years later, when Michael graduated from high school, he kissed that same bracelet before walking onto the stage. He whispered, "For both of us." I thought of every late bill I had hidden, every dinner of canned soup, every sleepless night spent praying he would never feel poor, even when we were. The applause that day felt like it belonged to both of us. I did not know then that the world would one day teach him to be ashamed of where he came from. Sometimes, love gives everything it has just to be forgotten when success arrives. Our house on Cherry Lane was barely large enough for the 2 of us. The roof leaked every winter, and the kitchen window never shut properly. But Michael loved it. We painted the walls together, bright yellow for the kitchen, because he said it made the mornings feel like sunshine. On Sundays, we made soup from whatever was left in the pantry, carrots, potatoes, sometimes just onions and salt. He would set the table, humming, while I stirred the pot. The steam fogged up the glass and left little handprints on the window. That was our happiness, small, imperfect, but real. When he was 16, Michael got a part-time job at the grocery store. One evening, he came home with a pair of new baseball shoes. I thought he had bought them for himself, but he placed them on the table in front of me. "For you," he said, "so you don't have to worry anymore." I tried to protest, but he smiled in a way that silenced me. It was then I saw what kind of man he was becoming: kind, responsible, and determined to make me proud. He would go on to college with scholarships, then law school. Every time he called, he ended with the same words, "Love you, Mom, you made me." And every time, I would touch the bracelet on my wrist and whisper, "I know." But love changes as children grow. It stretches, it bends, and sometimes it breaks under the weight of other people's voices. The night Lydia told me I no longer belonged, I realized how fragile that bond had become. I thought about every meal, every shift, every sacrifice that had built his life. Did none of it matter now that someone else had rewritten the meaning of family? The sound of the rain outside grew louder. I looked at my wrist. The silver had dulled over time, but the engraving was still there. M+H. It was both a promise and a warning. Because when something has been built from sacrifice, it never falls quietly. That night, I lay awake, listening to the storm, and I remembered the last thing I told him before he left for college. No matter how far you go, always know where home is. Now, decades later, I wondered if he had forgotten, or worse, if someone had convinced him that home was something he should be ashamed of. The thought stayed with me long after the thunder faded, and I had no idea that by morning, everything I had built would begin to unravel. The next morning, as I stood at the kitchen window, watching the rainwater slide down the glass, my mind drifted back 3 years, to the day Michael first brought Lydia home. Looking back, I realized the storm didn't start on the night of the rehearsal dinner. It began that afternoon, under the glow of sunlight spilling through my kitchen curtains, when a stranger walked through my door and smiled as if she already owned the place. Michael's voice had carried through the hallway before I saw them. "Mom, you're going to love her," he called. I wiped my hands on my apron, heart lifting at the sound of his excitement. For so long, it had just been the two of us. The idea that he had found someone who made him happy filled me with something close to pride. When she appeared behind him, I remember thinking how perfect she looked. Lydia Carter, tall, poised, with the kind of beauty that made everyone else in the room feel slightly less real. Her nails were painted a shade of pale rose that probably had a name like Grace or Serenity. She extended her hand and said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I've heard so much about you." Her voice was warm, but her eyes were already cataloging everything: the chipped teacup on the counter, the faded curtains, the old photographs on the wall. "You must call me Helen," I said, smiling, "and welcome to our little corner of Maplewood." Michael beamed at us both, oblivious to the faint stiffness in her shoulders. He pulled out a chair for her at the kitchen table. I had spent the whole morning cooking chicken pot pie, mashed potatoes, and my chocolate fudge cake, his favorite since childhood. "It smells amazing in here," Michael said, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "I told Lydia, nobody cooks like you." Lydia laughed softly. "It does smell good, very homey." That word lingered in the air like a thread pulled too tight. Homey. I didn't know whether to take it as a compliment or a warning. Dinner began politely enough. She asked about my work at the hospital, about Maplewood, about how long I had lived alone. But each question carried a certain edge, as though she were flipping through a resume instead of having a conversation. When Michael stepped into the other room to take a call, her tone shifted. "So," she said, stirring her wine with the tip of her finger, "Michael tells me you've always been very close." "Yes," I said. "It's just been the two of us for a long time." "How nice." The way she said it didn't sound nice at all. Before I could reply, Michael returned and slid his arm around her shoulders. Her expression softened instantly, her smile blooming like a flower under sunlight. I realized then that Lydia had two faces, one for him and another for the world when he wasn't watching. After dessert, when I placed the chocolate fudge cake in front of them, Lydia tilted her head, pretending to admire it. "Oh, that's sweet. But Michael's on a new diet. We're cutting back on sugar. I'll make sure he doesn't touch this." Her manicured hand moved the cake aside. The knife she used to slice through it left a thin trail of chocolate across the white tablecloth. Michael laughed awkwardly. "Mom's been making that cake since I was 10. Traditions are lovely," she said, dabbing at the smudge. "But we're building new ones now." That was the first time I felt it, the quiet, deliberate erasure of everything that had once defined us. When they left that evening, I stood by the window watching their car disappear down the street. The kitchen was still warm, filled with the scent of cocoa and sugar, but the table looked different. The cake sat untouched, its frosting beginning to harden. The fork beside it had a small fingerprint of chocolate where Michael had almost taken a bite before stopping himself. I wrapped the cake, placed it in the refrigerator, and told myself I was imagining things. Maybe she was nervous, maybe she didn't mean it that way. But even as I said it, I felt a small crack open somewhere deep inside. Months passed, and Lydia became a regular presence. She visited for holidays, birthdays, and Sunday dinners, always perfectly dressed, always just slightly distant. When she spoke to me, her words were polished, but her eyes were never warm. She called me sweetheart, but there was a chill in it, like a snowflake that never melted. Once, at Thanksgiving, I tried to share a story from Michael's childhood, the time he stayed up all night trying to glue together a broken toy truck for a neighbor's kid. Lydia cut in before I could finish. Michael's told me he's always been very driven, she said, turning the conversation toward his career. He's going to be a brilliant attorney. Everyone in the firm already sees his potential salary climbing. The table went silent for a moment. The turkey steamed, the cranberry sauce glistened, and I realized that she didn't see my son as a person. She saw him as an investment. That night, after they left, I found myself cleaning the table long after it was already spotless. Each clink of the dishes sounded louder than it should have. When I reached into the fridge for leftovers, I saw the old chocolate fudge cake sitting there again, the same one I had baked out of habit, untouched once more. I sat at the kitchen table, the room dim except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My hands rested on the silver bracelet Michael had given me years before. The engraving had faded, but I could still feel the letters with my fingertips. M+H. It was then I understood what had been gnawing at me. Lydia did not want to join our family. She wanted to replace it. I thought I could manage it, thought I could be patient, thought love would eventually soften her. But sometimes love is blind in more ways than one. It makes you ignore the glint of a knife right before it cuts. I told myself I would keep quiet for Michael's sake. After all, mothers are supposed to endure. But as the months turned into years, I could feel something changing inside me. Something small and defiant that refused to be erased. And though I didn't know it then, that defiance would one day save us both. I had promised myself to stay patient for Michael's sake, to be polite, gracious, and silent if that was what peace required. But that promise broke the moment Lydia leaned toward me at the rehearsal dinner and whispered the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "You've done your part. Tomorrow, he's mine. Don't embarrass yourself." For a second, I thought I had misheard her. The music was soft, the laughter from nearby tables muffled by the heavy velvet curtains, and yet her voice cut through everything like a thin blade. She was smiling, her lips painted the color of bruised cherries, her hand resting lightly on Michael's arm. No one else saw her eyes, or the warning in them. The restaurant lights were low, the air thick with perfume and the faint sweetness of wine. Golden dust floated through the air, catching in the light like tiny suspended stars. Across the room, guests were clinking glasses, toasting to love and beginnings. Lydia's laughter blended with theirs, as if she belonged perfectly among them. I stood at the edge of it all, invisible in a crowd I had once dreamed of joining. When she leaned in again, her voice was almost tender. "You can go home now, Helen. Rest. Tomorrow will be too much for you." My throat closed around words that would not come. I wanted to say that I had earned my place here, that I had worked for 27 years to stand beside my son on his wedding day. I wanted to remind her that I was the one who had taught him how to tie his shoes, to write his name, to keep his promises. But her eyes told me she already knew. That was what made her smile. I left before dessert. No one noticed. Outside, the night was warm, the sky painted in deep shades of purple. The parking lot shimmered with reflections of the street lamps on wet pavement. I could still hear faint jazz music leaking from inside, the rhythm distant and hollow. When I opened my car door, I caught sight of my own reflection in the window. Lipstick fading, hair falling out of place, the faint trace of tears beneath my eyes. I had not realized until then that I was shaking. The drive home blurred into colors. The lights of Maplewood seemed foreign, every building familiar yet somehow hostile. My heart thudded in my chest like a slow drum. I parked in front of my house and sat in silence for a long time, the key still in the ignition. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. I had left a candle burning earlier, its flame flickering against the framed photos on the mantel. Michael's childhood filled the room. The Little League medals, the art projects, the picture of him holding up his first report card. I took the scrapbook from the coffee table and set it on my lap. Its leather cover was smooth, worn from years of touching. Inside were hundreds of moments no one else would ever see the same way again. I turned a page. There was a photo of Michael at 6, standing in the backyard with a garden hose, laughing so hard the sun seemed to shine brighter around him. I turned another page and found a note he had written when he was 12. "You're the best mom. Don't ever be sad." The ink had faded to pale blue. I pressed my fingers over the words until they blurred. When I reached the last page, my hand began to tremble. The photo there was from the day he graduated law school. Lydia stood beside him, smiling for the camera, and I stood just behind them, almost out of frame. Looking at it now, I realized she had already begun erasing me even then. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder until the sound filled the room. I could not tell if minutes or hours had passed. At some point, my tears spilled onto the pages, darkening the edges of the photographs. One slipped from my hands and fluttered to the floor. When I bent to pick it up, my bracelet caught the candlelight. The small engraving of M+H gleamed faintly, the only thing still shining in that dim room. For a long while, I just sat there, listening to the rain that had begun again outside. Every drop seemed to echo the beating of my heart. I thought of Michael's face when he smiled at her, the way his eyes softened. He was happy, or at least he believed he was, and I had no right to take that from him. But I also knew that some truths reveal themselves whether we want them to or not. I whispered into the quiet, "If this is what love looks like, then maybe I've been wrong all these years." The candle flickered, its light casting shadows that stretched across the photographs like hands reaching out from the past. I tried to steady my breathing, but each inhale carried the bitter taste of regret. I wanted to scream, to call him, to tell him what she had said. But what good would that do? He would defend her, and I would lose him completely. So I did the only thing left that still felt like control. I made a choice. I placed the scrapbook back on the table and folded my hands in my lap. The air was so still, it felt as if the entire house was holding its breath with me. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would not go. The thought startled me at first. It felt too cruel, too final. But the longer I sat there, the more it began to feel like peace. For 27 years I had shown up for him. I had fought for him, sacrificed for him, loved him past exhaustion. Maybe this one day could belong to me, to my silence, my dignity, my grief. The rain softened to a whisper. I turned off the light, the room dissolving into darkness. The only glow came from the dying candle, its flame bending low as if bowing out. I closed my eyes and felt something I had not felt in years: stillness. It was not comfort, it was not forgiveness, but it was something close to strength. When the candle finally went out, the smell of smoke lingered in the air. I knew that when morning came, the world would move forward without me. I thought that would be the end of it. But life, I would soon learn, has a way of bringing every hidden truth back into the light. When the candle finally went out, I thought sleep would come, but it didn't. I sat in the dark until the faint gray of morning seeped through the curtains. The house was still. Even the clock seemed quieter, as if it knew the day ahead would demand silence. I rose slowly, my joints stiff, my chest heavy. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving behind that clean, fragile scent of wet pavement and pine. It was the kind of morning I had always loved, soft, forgiving, peaceful. But that day, it felt hollow, like the air itself had been emptied of meaning. In my closet, the pale blue dress hung neatly on its hanger. Michael had picked it out for me months earlier during one of our rare afternoons together. "That color makes you glow," he'd said. I had kept it pressed and ready, imagining how it would shimmer under the soft light of the church. Now, as I ran my hand along its fabric, it felt like a memory that belonged to someone else. I slipped it on anyway. It fit perfectly, as if made for this quiet rebellion. When I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes were tired, but they carried something new: resolve. In the kitchen, the smell of coffee filled the air. Steam rose from the cup, curling in thin, ghostly shapes. I cupped it between my hands, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. My phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with messages. "Where are you, Mom? We're heading to the venue now." "You're running late, aren't you?" "Typical." I turned the phone face down. Outside, the church bells began to ring. The sound carried across the quiet neighborhood, bright and distant. Once, that sound would have filled me with joy. I would have been the first to arrive, camera in hand, waiting to see my boy in his tuxedo. But now, each chime felt like a nail sealing a door I would never open again. I took a sip of coffee. It was bitter. Maybe I had forgotten the sugar, or maybe nothing would have tasted right that morning. The robe I wore over the dress felt too heavy. The silence pressed on me until I could hear my own heartbeat. I thought about Michael's childhood mornings, how he used to sit at this very table, legs swinging, eating cereal while humming off-key. The sunlight had always caught in his hair then, making him look like something too bright for this world. He used to tell me that when he grew up, he would buy me a house by the sea so I could rest. Somewhere along the way, the sea had turned into a city skyline, and rest had turned into distance. The phone buzzed again. I didn't move. Instead, I reached for the small silver bracelet on my wrist. The engraving had dulled with age, but when I traced my finger over the letters M plus H, it felt alive. It struck me then that motherhood had never been about ownership. We raise them, we teach them, we give everything we have, but in the end, they belong to the world. Maybe that was the real meaning of love, letting go before you are ready. I stood by the window and watched the rain start again, light and steady. Drops rolled down the glass, blurring the view of the maple trees outside. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a car horn, a child's laughter, the muffled hum of life moving forward. "He's not mine to protect anymore," I said aloud. The words came out steadier than I expected. The house answered with silence. It wasn't the cold, empty kind. It was a silence that made space for truth. I sat down at the table and let my mind wander. I imagined them all at the church now, Lydia radiant in her gown, Michael standing at the altar, guests whispering and smiling. I could almost hear the music, the swell of the organ, the collective breath of anticipation before she walked down the aisle. I pictured it all so vividly that for a moment, it felt real. I almost rose from my chair, almost grabbed my purse, almost reached for my keys. But then I saw my reflection again in the window, the blue dress glowing faintly in the morning light, and I knew it wasn't my place anymore. Instead, I lifted the scrapbook box from under the table. I had put it away the night before, thinking I would never open it again, but now I wanted to see it one last time. The first page was still damp from tears. The photo of Michael at 7 smiled up at me, gap-toothed and proud, holding his toy truck. Beneath it, I had written in careful handwriting, "For the boy who made me brave." My vision blurred again. I closed the book and pressed it to my chest. The heartbeat underneath it was slow, steady, alive. The sound of the bells faded, replaced by the low rumble of thunder. The storm was returning. I walked to the door and opened it just enough to feel the cool wind brush my face. The smell of earth and rain filled the air, rich and grounding. For a moment, I wondered what people would say when they noticed I wasn't there. Would they whisper? Would they judge? Probably. But that didn't matter anymore. The world would think what it wanted. I had spent too many years living for other people's comfort. I closed the door softly and turned the lock. The echo of it felt final. Then, as I walked back to the table, my phone began to ring again. I stared at it, at the name glowing on the screen. Michael. My hand hovered over it, shaking. I wanted to hear his voice, to tell him that I loved him, to warn him one last time about what I had seen in Lydia's eyes. But love can be a trap too, especially when it becomes a habit of saving those who do not yet know they need saving. I let it ring until it stopped. The quiet afterward was deafening. I poured the rest of the coffee into the sink and watched the dark liquid swirl down the drain. The smell lingered, sharp and bitter, like memory itself. I walked into the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch. The scrapbook was still in my hands. I placed it beside me and folded my arms across my chest. Outside, the rain grew heavier. In the distance, I thought I heard sirens, or maybe it was just the wind. I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to simply exist, without duty, without fear, without apology. If anyone had walked by my window that morning, they would have seen a woman sitting alone in a blue dress, her hair loose, her eyes closed, her face calm. They might have thought she was waiting for something. And in a way, I was. I was waiting for the world to move without me. I was waiting for the weight of motherhood to loosen its grip. I was waiting for the truth to come find me. I didn't know it then, but it was already on its way. I was still sitting in the living room, listening to the rain and the ticking of the clock when the phone began to ring again. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another relative, wondering why I had not shown up. But then I saw the name on the screen. It was my sister, Ruth. Her voice trembled as soon as I answered. "Helen," she said, "you need to sit down." Something in her tone made the air leave my lungs. "What happened?" the wedding's off. For a moment, I thought she was joking, or that maybe she meant delayed, postponed, something ordinary and fixable. But her breathing was fast, uneven, the kind that comes when truth hits like lightning. "What do you mean off?" I asked. "It's over," she whispered. "Michael called it off right before the ceremony. Helen, there are pictures. Lydia, with someone else." The world tilted. My first thought was not anger or triumph. It was sorrow. For my son, for the child I had carried and shielded for nearly 3 decades. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, as if I could hold him through it. "Are you sure?" "Yes. The man she's been seeing is her boss. It started months ago, maybe longer. Someone sent the photos to Michael's best friend this morning. He showed him right before the ceremony." I could hear voices in the background through the phone, muffled gasps, footsteps, the chaos of a wedding unraveling. Ruth's voice lowered. "It's not just that. Her family, they've been hiding debts. A lot of them. Over $600,000, Helen. The wedding wasn't about love. It was about money." I sank onto the couch, my knees giving way. The scrapbook beside me slid to the floor, spilling a few photos across the carpet. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, soft at first, then growing louder. Through the ringing in my ears, I could still hear Ruth's words. "Michael's furious. He's confronting her now." "Where are you?" I asked. "Still at the church," she said. "But Helen, it's chaos. People are crying. Lydia's parents are trying to quiet everything, but it's too late. Everyone knows." I closed my eyes and tried to picture it, the guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the flower arrangements wilting under the heat of whispered scandal, the organist's hands frozen above the keys. I imagined Michael standing there in his black suit, the same one he had shown me weeks ago, saying he wanted to look like the man his father never was. I imagined his face when he saw the photos, the shock, the disbelief, and then the understanding that everything he had been building toward his wedding, his future, his faith in love, had been built on lies. I wanted to reach him, to hold him, but I also knew I couldn't fix this. Some lessons, even the cruel ones, can't be softened by a mother's hands. Ruth's voice came again, smaller this time. "Helen," he said something before he left the church. He said, "You tried to erase my mother, but now everyone will see who you really are." Then, he walked out. For a moment, the room went completely still. My hand flew to my mouth. I felt something sharp and bright rise in my chest, something that was not joy, but justice. "He said that?" "Yes, loud enough for everyone to hear." Lydia ran after him, but he didn't look back. I turned toward the window. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing, pale light breaking through the clouds. My reflection stared back at me, the woman who had been told to stay home, to stay silent. Now her silence had been broken, not by her voice, but by truth itself. When Ruth hung up, I sat for a long time without moving. I could almost hear the echoes of that church, the stunned murmurs, the scrape of chairs, the faint rustle of silk as Lydia's white dress crumpled to the floor. I pictured the moment he said it, the courage in his voice, the heartbreak beneath it. "You tried to erase my mother, but now everyone will see who you really are." The sentence played again and again in my mind until it became a rhythm, steady and defiant. Outside, a car passed by, sending ripples through the puddles on the street. I wondered if the guests were leaving now, walking to their cars in silence, their shoes soaking through. Maybe someone was still comforting Lydia, the beautiful bride whose perfect life had shattered before the vows could be spoken. Maybe her mother was crying, or maybe she was calculating how to control the story before it spread. I leaned back against the couch and let out a long, uneven breath. There was no joy in what had happened, only a strange, aching peace. I hadn't wished this on anyone, but I couldn't deny the truth either. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Michael. Just 3 words. "I'm coming home." I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I rose from the couch and began to tidy the room. It was an old habit, something I did when the world felt too large to face. I picked up the photos that had fallen from the scrapbook, smoothing them gently before placing them back inside. The page with his graduation picture caught my eye again. He was smiling then, his arm around me, the future stretching out before him like an open road, the same road that had led him to today. I turned the photo over. On the back, I had written in pencil, "For the man who learned to stand." The words hit differently now. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for me, for truth, for everything that had been buried beneath years of sacrifice. The rain began again, softer this time, washing against the windows in a slow rhythm. I could almost imagine it washing away the lies, the shame, the years of quiet endurance. For the first time in a long while, I let myself smile not out of victory, but out of relief. Somewhere across town, the church was emptying, the decorations being taken down, the flowers already wilting. The wedding that was supposed to be the start of their new life had become an ending instead. But maybe that was what needed to happen. Some stories have to collapse before they can be rebuilt with truth. I poured myself another cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the sky open wider. The bells that had rung for a wedding were silent now. In their place was the quiet sound of rain and the knowledge that sometimes, even when you stay home, life delivers its justice at your doorstep. And I knew, deep in my bones, that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something neither of us could yet see. The quiet peace that had settled over my house after Ruth's call did not last. By the time the sky darkened again that evening, my phone began to buzz like a living thing. At first, I thought it was friends checking in, perhaps neighbors who had heard about the wedding being canceled. But when I finally picked it up, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The first message was a link to an article shared on social media. The headline read, "Jealous Mother Ruins Son's Wedding." Beneath it was a photo of Lydia, still in her wedding dress, her mascara streaked down her face like black rain. Her hands were pressed together as if in prayer, her mouth curved into the perfect image of grief. The caption below the picture said, "Some people just can't let go." I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. The post had already gathered hundreds of comments. People who had never met me were writing things I couldn't believe another human could say. What kind of mother does this? She must have been jealous of her own daughter-in-law. Old women like her can't stand losing control. Every line was a knife, and I read them all. I told myself to stop, but I kept scrolling, as if the pain might somehow make sense if I read enough of it. By the time I set the phone down, my hands were shaking. Within an hour, my inbox filled with anonymous messages. "Monster, old hag, you destroyed your son's life." The words flashed across the screen in cold white light. I walked to the window, the same one where I had stood that morning, and looked out at the street. The rain had stopped again, but the clouds hung low and heavy. For the first time that day, I felt truly alone. Michael arrived just after sunset. His car pulled into the driveway without headlights, quiet as a confession. When he stepped through the door, his face was pale, his suit jacket wrinkled, the exhaustion in his eyes deeper than I had ever seen. He didn't speak at first. He just came to me, and I opened my arms. He held on for a long time. His shoulders trembled, but he didn't cry. I could feel the anger inside him, sharp and restless, like a storm trapped behind glass. "She's saying I let you manipulate me," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "That you made me cancel the wedding." "I know," I whispered. "I saw the posts." He pulled away, running a hand through his hair. "Her family is spreading lies. They're telling everyone you showed up at the church, that you screamed in front of the guests." I almost laughed. The absurdity of it was almost comical, if it hadn't hurt so much. "I never even left the house," I said quietly. "I know, Mom," he exhaled slowly. "Don't reply to anything, please. Truth wins slowly." His words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. Truth might win slowly, but lies always travel fast. After he went upstairs to shower, I sat back down at the kitchen table, the same place where I had waited that morning. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed suffocating. My phone buzzed again, a notification from a local news outlet. The headline mirrored the others: "Family drama erupts at Maplewood wedding." The article quoted Lydia's parents. "The mother of the groom caused great emotional distress. The bride is devastated." It didn't matter that it wasn't true. The lie had already taken flight, and I was the villain in a story the world found easier to believe. I thought of the hospital cafeteria, where I had spent half my life, serving food to people who didn't even know my name. I had always believed that if you worked hard and stayed kind, the world would see you clearly. But I was learning now that clarity meant nothing to those who profit from confusion. The phone rang again. It was Ruth. Her voice was thick with anger. "Helen, have you seen what they're saying about you?" "I have," I said softly. They're calling you jealous. They're saying you ruined everything to keep him for yourself." I looked around the room. The coffee cup from that morning still sat by the sink, the faint ring it left behind dark against the counter. "They don't need the truth, Ruth. They just need a story." She fell silent for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I will be," I said, "but I can't stay quiet forever." That night, long after Michael had fallen asleep, I sat in the living room with only the glow of my phone lighting the walls. I scrolled through the photos again. Lydia crying, her parents embracing her as if she were the only victim. The comments piled beneath like waves. This poor girl. That mother should be ashamed. Something inside me hardened. For decades, I had built my life on silence, on patience, endurance, forgiveness. But silence, I was learning, doesn't save you. It erases you. I opened the drawer of the coffee table and pulled out the old folder where I had kept everything from the wedding planning emails to the receipts for the scrapbook supplies. On top of it lay a newspaper clipping from years ago, a quote I had once saved from an advice column. "When the world misnames you, speak your name louder." I read it twice, tracing the words with my finger. The tears that came then weren't from weakness. They were from clarity. I didn't know yet how to fight back, but I knew I would. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window pane, sharp and insistent. I imagined it sweeping through the town, carrying whispers of what had really happened, clearing the air of lies. Maybe that was wishful thinking, or maybe it was a promise. Before I went to bed, I opened the window just enough to feel the cool night air brush against my skin. The world outside was quiet, but beneath that quiet, something was shifting. I could feel it. If lies could spread like wildfire, then truth could burn too. It just needed time to catch. And as I closed the window and turned off the light, I whispered into the darkness, "If you've ever had lies told about you, remember this. Truth takes time, but it always comes." The next morning, the sky above Maplewood was a pale, brittle gray. I had not slept at all. The storm inside me had replaced the one outside. Every cruel word online, every whisper in town, every shadow that dared to call me jealous, it all pressed against my chest like a weight. But beneath it, there was something else taking shape. Not anger, exactly. Something sharper, something with purpose. I had spent my life avoiding conflict, smoothing over problems, teaching myself that silence kept peace. But this was not peace. It was surrender. And I had already surrendered too much. When I found the old business card tucked inside my recipe book, I knew what I needed to do. The card was yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded. Linda Price, financial law consultant. Linda had been a friend from my hospital days, a woman who believed that truth, like medicine, could heal if used correctly. I called her. She answered on the second ring. "Helen," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It's been years." "I know," I said, "but I think I've stumbled into something terrible, and I need help." Within the hour, I was sitting in her office, the smell of old paper and coffee wrapping around us. Linda looked just the same, sharp eyes, silver hair cut clean at the chin, the kind of woman who never forgot anything. I spread the papers across her desk, copies of Lydia's emails, the draft of the prenuptial agreement that had been sent to Michael a week before the wedding. Even the old texts Lydia had forwarded to my son under the guise of planning details. Linda adjusted her glasses and began to read. Her face grew still. Then she looked up at me. "Helen," she said slowly, "this isn't just manipulative. It's criminal." She turned the pages toward me, pointing to a clause written in dense legal jargon. "Right here," she said, Clause 12. It states that in the event of divorce within the first 5 years, 70% of your son's future earnings would automatically be transferred into an account managed jointly by Lydia and her father. I stared at the paper. 70%? Linda nodded. "It's disguised as a protective measure, but this isn't protection. It's extortion. They were trying to bind him to their family's debts." I pressed a hand to my chest. The air in the office felt thin. "So the marriage was never real." "Not for her," Linda said. "For them, it was a business merger. Your son was the asset. You were the liability." The word stung, but it fit. I remembered Lydia's voice at the rehearsal dinner, the calm certainty when she told me I no longer belonged. Of course she wanted me gone. I was the only witness who could see what she was truly buying. "What do I do now?" I asked. Linda leaned back in her chair, her eyes glinting. We do what they never expected. We tell the truth. Not in whispers, not in anger, but in public. It took days to gather everything. Linda helped me draft a summary of the findings, clear and factual. The evidence spoke louder than emotion ever could. Together, we sent the documents to the Maplewood Herald, the same paper that had printed the first gossip about the wedding disaster. When I pressed send, my hand trembled, but it wasn't from fear, it was from relief. I decided that if I was going to face them, I would not do it as the frightened woman they believed I was. I went to my closet and took out the pale blue dress, the one Michael had chosen for the wedding, the one that had become a symbol of everything I had been denied. The color had always reminded me of calm skies, but that day, it felt like armor. Linda called that afternoon. They want to meet, she said. Lydia's family, at the Carter Hotel downtown. They're trying to do damage control. You don't have to go. I do, I said. The hotel lobby shimmered with chandeliers and marble floors. I could hear my own footsteps echoing as I crossed the hall. Lydia and her parents were already there, sitting at a long table in the private dining room. Lydia's dress was black this time, her hair pulled back so tightly it made her look older. Her mother's pearls glowed against her throat. Her father's smile was polished, the kind you practice in mirrors before stepping into courtrooms. Lydia's father stood as I approached. Mrs. Whitaker, he said smoothly, I'm glad you agreed to speak. I think we can resolve this misunderstanding like civilized people. Misunderstanding, I repeated. The word hung in the air like smoke. Lydia looked at me with feigned pity. We all want what's best for Michael. Surely you don't want to escalate things. I set the folder down on the table between us. You weren't marrying my son, I said, my voice steady. You were buying him. The silence that followed was absolute. Her father's face flushed. Lydia's eyes flickered, just for a moment, revealing the crack behind her perfect composure. Her mother was the first to speak. That's a cruel accusation. It's not an accusation, I said. It's math. I opened the folder and slid the pages across the table, the evidence Linda and I had gathered. Clause 12, I said quietly. 70% of his future earnings. Funny kind of love, isn't it? Lydia's father reached for the papers, but I placed my hand on top of them first. You spread lies about me to save yourselves. You painted me as jealous, bitter, controlling. But now everyone will see who was controlling whom. Lydia's lips parted. You don't have the right to make this public. I already did. Her face paled. You wouldn't. I did, I said, and I smiled for the first time in weeks. The Maplewood Herald received every page this morning. Her father pushed back his chair. You've just made a terrible mistake. We'll sue you for defamation. You can try, I said, but I think the court of truth has already opened. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of their silence was heavier than any threat. Lydia's mother stared at the tablecloth as if it could swallow her whole. When I stood to leave, I could feel Lydia's eyes following me. She whispered something under her breath that I didn't catch, but it didn't matter. For once, her words couldn't touch me. As I stepped out of the hotel, the sunlight hit the blue fabric of my dress, making it shimmer like the surface of water. I thought of Michael, of the way he had looked at me as a child when he wanted reassurance that the world was safe. I hoped he would see now that sometimes safety doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing up when no one expects you to. Outside, a cool wind lifted through the streets, carrying the scent of rain and city air. Somewhere, a church bell rang in the distance, the same sound that had once marked my heartbreak. Now it sounded like release. When I walked out of the Carter Hotel, the afternoon light felt different on my skin, softer somehow, cleaner. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy with the weight of what people thought about me. I had done what I came to do. The truth was no longer a secret hiding in the corners of my mind. It was out there now, breathing freely, finding its own way through the noise. 2 days later, the story appeared on the front page of the Maplewood Herald. The headline read, "Behind the Cancelled Wedding, a Mother's Fight for Dignity." Below it was a photo of the blue dress, captured as I had left the hotel, sunlight spilling across the fabric. The journalist, a young woman named Amy Collins, had written the piece with care. She had verified the documents, spoken to Linda, and traced the Carter family's debts through court records and business filings. The article was not cruel or dramatic. It was precise, patient, and thorough, the kind of truth that doesn't shout, only stands tall and lets others come to it. It explained how the Carters had planned to merge their failing company with Michael's promising career, how Lydia had hidden her affair, and how, when the lies began to collapse, they tried to rewrite the story by destroying my name. By the end of that day, the world had turned. The same people who had called me jealous and bitter now filled the comment sections with apologies. I can't believe we believed her lies. That poor woman, she didn't deserve this. Thank you for standing up for yourself. And then, something unexpected happened. Letters began to arrive, dozens at first, then hundreds, some handwritten, some typed, all carrying pieces of stories I had never heard before. Women from all over the state wrote to me, teachers, widows, nurses, grandmothers. Many said the same thing. You spoke for us. One woman wrote, I was told to stay quiet when my daughter-in-law pushed me away. I thought maybe it was just me. Thank you for reminding me it wasn't. Another said, my children stopped visiting when I got sick. I thought silence was love. Now I see it was surrender. I read every letter, each one a small miracle. They piled up on the dining table, the same table where I had once cried into my coffee, the same table where the scrapbook had rested, soaked with tears. The world can be cruel, but sometimes, when truth finally rises, it brings others with it. Michael was offered a new position in a law firm in Columbus not long after that. It was a firm that valued integrity over prestige, a place where his compassion mattered as much as his education. When he told me, his voice was lighter than I had heard it in years. They said they read the article, he said with a small, shy smile. They liked the way I handled everything. I felt something warm settle in my chest. I think they liked the man you've become, I said. We decided to have dinner together that night, just the two of us, no reservations, no expectations. I cooked his favorite meal, simple pasta with garlic and olive oil, and baked the chocolate fudge cake I hadn't made since the night Lydia dismissed it as old-fashioned. The smell filled the house again, rich and comforting, wrapping around us like memory itself. After dinner, we sat on the porch. The sky above Maplewood was painted with streaks of pink and gold fading into dusk. Crickets hummed in the grass, and the air carried the faint scent of lilac. Michael leaned back in his chair, quiet for a long while before he spoke. I keep thinking about what you said that morning, he murmured, that I wasn't yours to protect anymore. I looked at him. His face, once so boyish, now carried the lines of a man who had been tested and found his strength. And? I asked. He smiled, that familiar soft smile that always reminded me of his childhood. You were wrong, he said. You'll always protect me, even when you're not trying to. I felt my throat tighten. Before I could respond, he reached over and took my hand. His fingers brushed against the silver bracelet still circling my wrist. It had dulled with age, but the engraving was still there, faint and sure, M+H. You were always my family, he said quietly. The words filled the space between us like light. I turned my hand over and squeezed his. And you were always my reason. For a while, we just sat there in silence, watching the fireflies flicker in the yard. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be broken because it means everything has already been said. When the night grew cool, I went inside and took the scrapbook from the shelf. The leather cover was worn now, the pages slightly bent, but the photos inside had dried, their colors bright again. I opened it to the first page, the picture of Michael as a child, standing barefoot in the grass, laughing at something unseen. The corner of the page still had a faint mark where a tear had fallen and dried. As I turned each page, I saw more than just a life. I saw proof of endurance. The bracelet gleamed faintly under the lamplight. The scent of the cake still lingered in the kitchen. The blue dress hung by the door, freshly washed and folded, waiting for another day that might require strength. Scrapbook, bracelet, cake, dress, each one a small piece of my life, bound together by something larger than pain, by love that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. Michael stood behind me, looking over my shoulder at the photos. You kept everything, he said. Of course I did, I replied. Every memory matters, even the ones that hurt, especially those. He smiled. I guess you were right. The truth really does win slowly. It does, I said, closing the scrapbook. But when it wins, it stays. Outside, the night deepened. The moon rose over Maplewood, bright and unwavering. I leaned back against the porch railing and watched it climb. There are moments in life when you feel the world finally catch up to what you've always known in your heart. That was one of them. I had spent decades learning how to love quietly. Now, I was learning that dignity could be a kind of love too. The world had tried to erase me, but in the end, it had only drawn me more clearly. The night after that conversation with Michael, I sat awake for a long time on the porch, listening to the steady hum of the crickets and watching the moon drift above the rooftops. The world around me felt softer now, as if it had finally taken a breath after holding it for too long. For years, my life had been built around a single role: mother, caretaker, silent backbone. But something had changed. I was still those things, but now I was something else too, a woman who had found her voice after decades of whispering. That realization stayed with me, growing stronger each day until it became an idea I couldn't ignore. It started simply: a letter from one of the women who had written to me after the newspaper story. Her name was Margaret, a retired teacher from Indiana. She wrote, "You reminded me that it's not too late to matter." Then another letter arrived, and another, and another. They were all different, yet all carried the same quiet ache. Women who had been overlooked, dismissed, or told their stories were no longer worth hearing. One morning, as I sat at the dining table surrounded by their letters, I realized what I needed to do. A month later, I rented the community hall on Main Street, the same space where, years ago, I had attended Michael's school plays and bake sales. I asked Linda to help me organize an evening of open conversation, a gathering for women who had spent too long feeling invisible. We called it No Mother Left Behind. On the night of the event, the hall glowed with the warm yellow light of hanging lamps. Folding chairs lined the room, every seat filled. The air carried the comforting blend of coffee and old wood, and there was a hum of nervous excitement, the kind that comes when strangers realize they might finally be understood. When I stepped up to the microphone, my hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what the moment meant. "Thank you for being here," I began, my voice soft but steady. "Tonight isn't about sorrow, it's about strength. About the women who built families, carried burdens, and still found a way to keep going, even when no one said thank you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not applause yet, but recognition. I invited others to speak. One by one, women rose from their seats and shared their stories. A grandmother who had raised 4 children alone after her husband's death. A widow who had been forced to sell her home when her children moved away. A retired nurse who said she had cared for hundreds of patients but couldn't remember the last time someone asked how she was. Each story was different, but the feeling was the same. They were not looking for pity. They were reclaiming their dignity. By the end of the evening, there was laughter mixed with tears. People hugged strangers. They promised to call each other, to visit, to stay connected. The loneliness that had once filled the room was replaced with something like belonging. As the crowd began to disperse, I stood by the window. Outside, the streetlights cast a golden glow across the pavement, and for a moment, the glass reflected dozens of faces lined, beautiful, alive with purpose. Linda walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did this," she said. "We did this," I replied. When the last guest left, I turned off the microphone and sat alone on the small wooden stage. The silence was comforting, full rather than empty. I could still hear faint echoes of laughter and clapping in the corners of the hall. The scrapbook lay beside me on the table, open to a page I hadn't looked at in years. A picture of me holding Michael as a newborn. My hair was messy, my eyes tired, but there was a kind of light in that photo, a promise that love, no matter how battered, could survive anything. The bracelet glinted faintly on my wrist, the same one I had worn through every chapter of this story. I smiled at it, thinking how far it had carried me. When I looked up, I noticed a young journalist from the Herald still lingering near the back, her camera in hand. "Mrs. Whitaker," she called softly. "Could we take one last photo?" I nodded. She adjusted her lens, and I sat upright, hands folded on the scrapbook, the soft light from the hanging lamps spilling across my face. For once, I didn't look away. I wanted to meet the camera head on, to let it see the woman I had become. Before she clicked the shutter, she said, "Is there anything you'd like to say to the readers?" I thought for a moment, then spoke clearly, so that every word would find its place. "We can lose our homes, our youth, even our place at the table," I said. "But we never lose our worth." The room was silent except for the soft whir of the camera. When the photo was taken, I stood and turned off the last light. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. The stars were faint but steady, and somewhere nearby, I could hear the sound of a train heading north. The world felt vast again, not frighteningly so, but in the way that reminds you how many stories are still waiting to be told. As I walked home, I passed a row of houses with their porch lights glowing. Through one window, I saw an elderly woman reading beside a sleeping dog. Through another, a young mother rocking her baby. Life continued, as it always does, but I knew that in some small way, things had shifted. Because when one voice rises, others follow. Later that night, I uploaded a short video from the event to my small community page. The title read, "No Mother Left Behind, a night for every woman who refuses to disappear." I watched the view count rise slowly, the comments filling with hearts and messages of love, some from people I knew, most from people I would never meet. And then, as the screen glowed in the dark, I recorded one last message, just a few simple words that I meant with every piece of my heart. "If you believe every mother deserves respect," I said, looking straight into the camera, "leave a heart in the comments and share this story where you're watching from. Let's make sure no woman ever feels invisible again." I ended the recording and closed the laptop. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of wind through the trees. The scrapbook lay open beside me, the pages catching the moonlight. It felt like an ending, but also a beginning. The final chapter, perhaps, but not the last story. Ending narration, final scene. Sometimes, we are not meant to be loved loudly, but to be remembered quietly, and that is enough. Because dignity is not given. It is reclaimed, one truth, one act of courage, one voice at a time. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Tell your own story. Share this video so another woman knows she's not alone. Leave a like if you believe every mother deserves respect. And subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter to hear the next story of strength, forgiveness, and quiet rebellion before anyone else. Every week, a new voice rises. Next time, we'll meet a grandmother who left her hometown with nothing and built a home where love found her again. Until then, remember, you are never too old, too late, or too forgotten to begin again.